Hello, everyone. This is Neslihan from COGIS, which is a community where students and professionals from various fields of study get around to make resources based on cognitive sciences more accessible and provide students a way of communication with the various events we hold throughout the year, such as academic cognition, which is a series of talks preferably given by undergrads and grad students who are relatively less recognized. Book cognition that provides an opportunity for professors and students to exchange ideas revolved around a book of choice for several weeks, and growing up in science, where professors share their lifelong experiences about the academic life. You can follow our accounts on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and you can also support us from the patreon.com, and we would truly appreciate your support. Today's event, named the Cognitive Webinar, is designed to be online and held entirely in English, aiming for an international audience. We would like to provide a platform not just for science communication, but also interaction of academics from all over the world. Today, we're going to listen to Dr. James McClelland, who is a professor in the psychology department and the director of the Center for Brain, Mind, Computation, and Technology at Stanford. He earned his PhD in cognitive psychology at University of Pennsylvania in 1975. His research focuses on a wide range of topics in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, such as perceptual decision-making, learning and memory, language and reading, semantic and mathematical cognition, and cognitive development. He is the co-founder of the Parallel Distributed Processing Research Grant with David Romelhart. He has received various awards for his contributions to research in cognitive psychology, such as the Atkinson Prize in Psychological and Cognitive Sciences and the Heineken Prize in Cognitive Science. Today, we're going to listen to his talk entitled Understanding Natural Language, Insights from Cognitive Science, Neuroscience, and Artificial Intelligence. His talk will last about an hour, and then we will give a 5-minute break. After the short break, we will proceed with the Q&A session, which will also last about 30 minutes. I would like to emphasize the fact that we would like our attendees to ask their questions with their microphones and video cameras open if possible, but it is not a requirement. You can also ask questions through the Zoom chat as well. So Dr. McClelland, take us away whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to have a chance to share my ideas with all of you today. A small fun fact is that when I got to college at Columbia University in New York City in 1966, I found out that my roommate was from Turkey. And I still very close to him. He's now a retired statistician from living in Chicago in the United States. I'm going to be talking to you today about my ideas about language understanding. And these are ideas that are not unique with me. I feel, as we'll see early in the talk, there was a man named John Bransford whose ideas I've only recently come to see are so intimately similar to how I currently think. But his ideas were first promulgated in the 1970s when I was still a PhD student. And they form the kind of the core of my effort to understand language to understand what it means to understand language, essentially, as a cognitive activity. And I'm going to be sharing those ideas with you, as well as some recent developments in cognitive neuroscience and artificial intelligence, which to me come together to allow us to begin to see how we could actually build an artificial system that could capture, the human cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying our language understanding ability with an artificial simulated neural network. I would like to invite you to, stop me and ask me clarification questions. A couple times during the talk, I will try to pause. I've asked the organizers to interrupt me and let me know if there's some pressing question in the chat. Of course, I want to save the broader philosophical the discussion for the end in the discussion section. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to start with the basic idea of the relationship between language and human understanding. And the way I state this myself is that the main role of language is to support communication of information about situations. What is a situation? Well, it's a set of relationships between real or fictitious objects and events as construed in the common ground between speakers and hearers. We're going to see some examples of situations that can be conveyed by sentences and language. So here's one of my favorite examples from Bransford et al. Let's read these two sentences together. 3 turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam under them. So, you know, when I understand that sentence, I sort of visualize a log and some turtles resting on it and a fish, you know, swimming under like that. Let's read the next sentence. 3 turtles rested beside a floating log, and a fish swam under them. Well, now the turtles are here, the log is there, and the fish is swimming over here under the turtles. Of course, it could be some other exact spatial arrangement, but the turtles are no longer on the log, right? They're beside it. So we construct rather different situation representations when we hear these two sentences. And it's a relationship between objects in the world rather than constituents of sentences, as Chomsky would have had it, right? So it turns out, I don't know how well known this is, but in the 1960s, most of the people who went to MIT to be Chomsky's students went there because they were interested in understanding, not syntax. It turned out that Chomsky didn't want to go there, and they had huge fights, and everybody was really unhappy with each other. All the people who were in this sort of like understanding camp moved to the West Coast eventually, George Lakoff, others. And so it never really became the core of mainstream linguistics, but it was a part of the ideation of many, many people in that period. And Bransford wasn't part of that at all. He was bringing these ideas from the outside. Okay. Here's another example. This one is from Winograd. John tried to put his trombone in his suitcase, but it was too small. So, you know, when you understand this sentence, I think what you have to do is you have to say to yourself, well, what was too small? Probably not the trombone, right? Because that would have fit. So it must be the suitcase was too small. If the sentence had said, John tried to put his trombone in the suitcase, but it was too large, we would then say, okay, the trombone is too large. Well, either way, we're building a representation of one thing being too big for another, and we're using our knowledge about the relationships between objects and what it means for something to fit in order to sort of figure out even what the it refers to in the sentence. Okay, so we're building a situation representation and using our knowledge of what makes sense in situations to understand this sentence. So I want to just emphasize the complexity and richness of what I mean by a situation, by this sentence that I made up. A more complex situation, which involves a change in belief about situations, involving relationships among classes of objects, right? That's what this sentence is communicating. Botanists once believed that the coast redwood and the giant sequoia belonged to the same genus, but evidence from DNA sequencing has led to a reconsideration of this view. In fact, the giant sequoia and the coast redwood are members of two rather different genuses, and they're rather different rather than being something that we should treat as the same genus. And of course, to understand exactly what this would mean, we have to know what a biologist means by a genus, and maybe this is something we don't fully understand. But we do know that it's sort of saying, oh, they're not as close in the family tree of trees as they might have been, right? They didn't evolve from the same ancestor as close back in the evolutionary history of things. So this is a situation involving beliefs that scientists have about where things belong in an abstract taxonomy. So it's rather more advanced than the relationship between frogs and logs and stuff like that. But I think that's...
Yes.
Hello? Was there a question?
I think
okay. This is the core of the idea. And of course, if this is what we have to now understand, well, how is it that we go about constructing these situation representations? And the argument is that we integrate information from multiple sources, any sources really. I believe that the constraints that we consider when we understand language are quite open-ended. We make inferences based on our understanding of the roles of objects and situations from previous experience. So if I say to you, John spread jam on some bread, the knife had been dipped in poison, well, you know that spreading jam often involves a knife. So you probably connect this by saying, okay, well, the knife was the knife he used to spread the jam. And then you also know that poison is something that might kill you or make you very sick. So you already are expecting that if John eats the bread, he might get sick or even die, right? And you bring this information from your understanding of what knives do, how they relate to spreading jam, and what poison does, and so on, right? So we're bringing knowledge to bear in constructing these representations and filling in inferences about what might happen and how the objects are linked in cases where it's not fully specified. We understand and remember text better when we can relate them to a familiar situation. So here's another example from a different Bransford paper. If the balloons popped, the sound wouldn't be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. This is the beginning of a somewhat longer passage that Bransford and Johnson used. And some subjects read it without any other context. Other subjects saw this picture before they read it, and some saw it after they read it. We can read it again now that we see this picture. Okay, so take a look at the picture. So now, if you read the passage, if the balloons pop, the sound wouldn't be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Now, each of these sentences makes sense in terms of this situation, which you've witnessed part of by looking at the picture of it. Or of course, in the real world, you might be looking at something and somebody would be describing things to you. They wouldn't have to describe everything because some of it would be in the common ground from the picture. So finally, just a piece of actual evidence from the results of psychological experiment. And they did find in that case that having the picture vastly improved people's ability to remember what they had read. But here's another example. A few minutes after hearing the first of these two sentences below, people accept either one as the one they read before with equal probability. Okay, so three turtles, we read one of these before. Three turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam under it. Three turtles rested on a floating log and a fish swam under them. So because the frogs are on this log, then under it and under them are essentially the same situation, right? And when subjects were asked, did you read this sentence before? They answered yes with equal probability, even if they, even though they only read one of these two sentences. But in the case where it was beside instead of on, they do not accept the first one as though they'd read it before, right? Because it's a different image. Now the fish are swimming under the log and not under the frogs. Okay, so I hope I've convinced you that we really do construct situations. We use information from various sources, and what we remember is the situation. Yes, we can force ourselves to remember the details of the wording of sentences, but that's not what we're trying to do usually. We're trying to understand what the person is talking about and remember the ideas, and those are information about situations. So we use linguistic and non-linguistic information jointly and immediately. This example is one that Jerry Altman, who's now at the University of Connecticut, has studied. If a subject listens to someone saying, the man drank, they will look at the beer glass here, the empty beer glass. If they read, the woman will drink, they look at the wine glass because it's still got something to drink in it. And this is not just like, oh, drinking, looking at glasses. It's like keeping track of temporal relationships, but it happens immediately, right? We're processing this information in real time and ready to anticipate the correct. So it's not like we do this sort of like understanding thing later after we process the sentence. We're doing it online as we listen. Okay, now, many of you, may be familiar with the argument that language is highly compositional. And I agree that it is compositional to an extent. And the argument that some people have made is that our cognitive architectures need to be intrinsically compositional. They need to essentially understand sentences as being composed of the meanings of the elements of the sentence. And that is what gives us our ability to understand an indefinitely large range of different sentences. But I have a different take on it. First of all, I think that language is compositional because the world is in some sense, well, at least approximately compositional or quasi-compositional. So let's consider this. Suppose a person picks an apple and gives it to someone. The entities involved are distinct, discrete entities. There's two people and an apple. And many parts of the situation could be changed in a way that has little effect on other parts. So the person receiving it or which apple he picked from the tree, these things are pretty independent of each other. And, when we pick an apple from a tree, the tree remains and the rest of it. Well, actually, we might jerk the branch a little bit and another apple might fall off the tree. But to a large extent, and maybe for the purposes of the main communication, these are the relevant participants in this event. And so it's useful to have languages that pick out these participants and specify, particular relationships that we're calling attention to that are changing or being described by the sentence. So the sentence, John picked an apple and gave it to Mary, captures most of the relevant participants in their relationships. And, these kinds of communications are extremely useful in conveying such things as, well, who's got the apple now? But they're not actually completely closed off, right? Could be that another apple fell, or it could be that somebody else is jealous because Mary's his girlfriend and he doesn't want John trying to appeal to her by giving her presents. And we can even think these other thoughts as part of our understanding of this situation. So we're not limited to the compositionality of this particular event. We can think of broader implications that follow from it. And so my perspective is that we shouldn't think of our cognitive architecture as being intrinsically compositional. We should think of our world of objects and situations as being largely compositional, and language as being an effective approximate way of characterizing the contents of the situations when it's compositional in this way. Also, compositionality is not universal or absolute, so it's best for these things to be a matter of degree. So many idiomatic expressions, have a degree of compositionality to them. Many collocations have a degree of compositionality, but a degree of special meaning that's added that makes it so that I believe it's best not to be rigidly compositional. Okay. So language is really important for our ability to understand situations because it allows us to share information about situations we haven't witnessed or aspects we cannot observe. And it allows us to communicate our construals of causal relationships. The gods must be angry. That's why we haven't had any rain. That is a construal of a situation, right? Properties that only arise in a social setting, such as ownership. This is mine and that's yours. And once we've agreed that this is mine and that's yours, and the only way we can document ownership is through a written document that says, this is John's land and this here land belongs to the other guy, right? Is through language, essentially. And so it establishes properties that don't otherwise even exist at some level or can't be verified or documented otherwise. And it establishes properties that have been identified by a culture as important, such as exact number. So there are cultures in the world where they don't have exact number, and they just have words like few and some and many, and they're used relatively. So he has some and I have many would be like, well, maybe I have 4 fish and he only has 2, but it could mean he has 6 fish and I have like a dozen or something. So in those cultures, the relative amount is all people are kind of really communicating about, right? Whereas in Western, I don't know, I don't like the word Western anymore. in cultures with advanced educational and technologies like number, we have acquired ways of construing situations that are different from what we'd have in different cultures. And number is just an example of that. So in a nutshell, language is not a distinct mental faculty. It's part of a system that we use to shape our representations of situations. And languages differ in the details of how they do this, but that's what they all ultimately do. Okay, maybe I should stop here before I go on to the brain and AI side of this. Any argument with what I've said or question about it so far? Israel, you seem to be happy with this. I see you. No, I don't have any questions. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, but if somebody wanted to, presumably this will be something that some of you want to discuss in the general discussion. But I'll just ask you to accept my general perspective on this for the sake of argument, and now we can ask this question: what kind of a computational system can capture human understanding of situations? So there's two perspectives on this. You know, they're contrasting with each other. The first one says abstraction, explicit representation of structure, and processing governed by structure-sensitive rules are inherent properties of the human understanding process. And we need to therefore build our systems in such a way that they have an explicit symbolic structured representation, and they manipulate these structures according to structure-sensitive rules. So this is the argument that Fodor and Polishin made in their 1988 criticism of neural networks. And, you know, at the time, I had some sort of fear in my heart that maybe they were right or something like that, because I had been arguing for an alternative already at that point. But now I'm a bit more kind of convinced that this is the wrong approach. I don't mean that we don't have the capability of learning to be sensitive to structure in human-like ways. But I argue that we should think about it in the second way, okay? So the second way is that abstraction, explicit representations of structure, and structure-sensitive rules are useful approximate descriptive characterizations rather than properties of the actual computational system underlying understanding. So I think it's very useful that Chomsky constructed a set of rules that captures so much of our intuition about the nature of sentences. I myself, when I was first exposed to those ideas, was like really excited about it, because previously I'd just been exposed to simple behaviorist ideas about cognition. And this suddenly seemed like something really interesting and important was being kind of clarified by these rules. There are these relationships that repeatedly occur in sentences, and we could use our knowledge of them to help us understand sentences that we've never seen before. Yes, that somehow I believe is true, but we don't necessarily represent it or think of it in terms of those explicit like rules in the bowels of our neural networks that do the computation. And this is the thing that Dave Rumelhart and I illustrated in our first foray into, you know, the world of language and rules, where we built a simple neural network that learned to map from aspects of the phonology of the root form of an English verb, like let's say bake, to its past tense, baked. When we keep the stem and we add a dental stop at the end, in this case, baked. If the word is love, we add a voiced dental stop. The voicing agrees with the voicing of the end of the word. And if it already ends in a dental stop, we add ud, right? So liked, loved, and hated are the three examples that I semantically link together in my mind, but they exemplify these three different. But we didn't have to write the rule down. We just trained the network with examples that exhibited this regularity, and it learned how to generalize to other examples. And that is the alternative to the idea that we explicitly represent this structure. If the structure is in the examples, it's something we can learn. And the structure for the compositionality of language ultimately comes from the compositionality of situations in the world. So the computational system, we argued, is a parallel distributed processing system implemented in the human brain. It doesn't explicitly represent the structure or use structure-sensitive rules. It's only the linguist who sits and thinks and says to themselves, gee, it would be nice to have a formal system which would allow us to determine if sentences are indeed sentences that we ought to expect people to think could be said in their languages. That's a useful tool, right? Could even imagine using such a tool in a legal adjudication of the meaning of a sentence in a document, right? Because people can otherwise just argue, well, I construed it this way, you construed it that way. Who's right? So at some point, the law will have to sort of write down the set of rules that describe what sentences and what the meanings of sentences are. It may be very difficult to do that, but those rules aren't in the head. They're things that we create to help us think about these things as scientists. And they approximately characterize the implicit rules in our head. That's my view. Okay. Why parallel distributed processing? Well, neurons in the brain are performing computations based on the influences they receive from other neurons. And these influences are graded and mutual, allowing our brains to rely on a graded mutual constraint satisfaction process to kind of form an interpretation using information from many sources that may be noisy, incomplete, or unreliable. And even if every aspect of an input is ambiguous, this constraint satisfaction process can result in a coherent interpretation. So this was actually the beginning of parallel distributed processing for me and Dave Rumelhart. David had written a paper in the mid-'80s called an interactive model of reading. And did I say in the 70s? Did I say 70s? I read this paper and I thought it was interesting. And I'd been studying context effects in perception. So David and I started to talk and we started to collaborate and we started to think about this. But the idea really came first from this paper of his. And I want to see if I can illustrate this last point with this image, which doesn't necessarily always work perfectly for all people all the time. But nevertheless, it worked for me the first time I saw it. So when you look at this, you may at first just see a jumble of blobs of black and white. This was actually a photograph of an actual scene that a photographer had taken, and then he pushed it in the developing process to make it come out so starkly black and white like this with no nuanced grays in the image. Some people, when they look at it, see a Dalmatian dog sniffing at the ground. And if you don't see it at first, you might look at it and say, oh, well, maybe this is the dog's head. Maybe there's something over here like a tree that's sitting inside of some ring, and the dog is sniffing at the ground here. And then if you do see the dog, you can almost sort of see where its back goes and where the edges of its legs must be. The front legs, maybe you can sort of make out the edges of them more clearly, but the back legs, there must be one here, right? And there's just enough information to sort of see that there must be a leg there if you see the dog. So the perception of the whole allows you to see aspects of the parts. The perception of the parts contributes to the perception of the whole. None of the elements of the input by themselves, I would argue, are sufficient, but with a context together with this input, you can eventually see the dog. And this is what a neural network allows, because there's all of these little computational elements, each integrating information from each other. Even if the information is noisy and incomplete or partial, it may be saying, well, I think it's, there's likely to be an edge here and there's likely to be an edge here. And then combining all these likely edges, it sort of fits together to make a dog. So with David, that's David there.
Hi, Dr. McClelland, we have a question on the chat asking that what characteristics of the distributed system are parallel?
Right. Each of the neurons is working at the same time as all the other ones. That's what we mean by parallel. So, if you think about your brain, there's all these neurons, they're sitting there. They might not all be firing all the time, right? But they're ready if they get inputs to start to fire. And, in this model that I'm about to show, there's neurons that we kind of stipulated for the sake of argument for features and letters and words, and they're all able to contribute simultaneously to the process. So I'm going to just illustrate this here on this slide. So we made a model of letter perception, which addressed the human ability to use context to identify letters in words and pronounceable non-words. For example, what's the second letter in this display here? Well, I'm guessing most of you think it's an I, and that most of you see this as the word time. But you might notice that the T that's just next to this position is completely consistent with the features that you're seeing. And this red blotch is obscuring the information that would tell you whether it's an I or a T. And so the idea in our model is that we use all the features of all the letters simultaneously together with units at feature, letter, and word levels that are all working, capable of interacting with each other in a parallel distributed process to settle on an interpretation of this input. So here's the model. It has units for words, actual words in the English language. I think there were 1,100 and some words in our original model. It has units for letters in each of 4 positions, and it has units for featural elements like, is there a bar across the bottom or not? When we present this display, we imagine that you get the input telling you about there's a horizontal bar across the top and a vertical bar down the middle, but you don't get the information about what's at the bottom of that second position. You get all the other information. It flows up, starts activating these neuron-like units. They in turn flow up and activate the relevant word unit. The relevant word unit, as it becomes active, it sends feedback back down and says, oh, it should be an I here, not a T. And the network settles into the interpretation that this is the word time, and this thing that initially is ambiguous based on the bottom-up input is the letter I. And that is our implementation of Rumelhart's idea that we use multiple graded, because the connection weights are matters of degree, sources of information at many levels and in many positions simultaneously to constrain our processing of any input. And we call this the interactive activation model because it's got bidirectional connections between letters and the words they're in, or between features and the letters they're in, as well as bidirectional inhibitory connections between units that are mutually exclusive of each other. So each letter in the first position is got inhibitory connections to all the other letters. And I didn't draw all that spaghetti in the diagram, but you can imagine that they're all mutually inhibitory. So there's mutual inhibition between alternative interpretations of the same aspect of the input, and mutual support between units that correspond to mutually consistent aspects of different levels of interpretation of the same. Rumelhart's paper talked about syntax, image, pictures, prior knowledge, all the things I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, simultaneously influencing the process as we read actual texts. And we implemented this in a model of perception of letters and words, which is what I had studied experimentally as a graduate student.
We have an additional question on the chat.
Okay.
It's asking, even if a neuron is not firing at a given time, isn't that also the part of the code?
Yeah. So we have this concept of what is the representation of something? And I like the idea that the representation is something we understand in terms of the similarity relationships among the patterns of activation in our neural networks. This is an instance where we have, before we understood what learning algorithms to use, we wired this up by hand. We made assumptions about how strong the connection weights should be, and we tried to keep them simple. But of course, Rumelhart then went on to develop backprop, and we started to think in terms of distributed representations. And in a distributed representation, which units are on and which units are off are all part of the vector representation. I totally accept that point. On the other hand, in the brain, it is very useful often to imagine that the representations, and this is especially true of the hippocampus, are sparse. And that is to say, we don't have a single neuron for any one concept, but we do have a sparse population of neurons, which together represents that concept. And when neurons are off, they're not contributing to the activation of other neurons, right? In fact, my model of the brain involves all the units being, in contemporary terms, like ReLU units. When they're suppressed below a certain level, they're not transmitting anything to any others. So their connection weights are only relevant once they exceed that threshold and begin to transmit. So the active neurons in the representation do play an important role. And if the representations are sparse, the connections coming out of them can be very specific. Like in this case, this unit can be telling us exactly which are the elements of the word time. So I think of this as a matter of degree. And the question of the sparsity of brain representations and why it is that different parts of the brain use different degrees of sparsity in their representations is fascinating and interesting. And we won't be able to get through all of that today, unfortunately. Okay, so I'm realizing I'm only about 40, well, maybe 50% of the way through my talk. So I'm going to go on to some contemporary AI language modeling after this core of the ideas from back in the 80s. Okay. So I think I talked about all those points. So, the big question that we began to face as we started thinking about parallel distributed processing is how the connections get to be what they are. The words in a language are arbitrary. Each language has its own words, and so we have to learn, which letters go together to make which words, and which phonemes go together to make which words if we're in a pre-literate society. But we have to learn that. So how does that work? Well, when we first started in on this, we were like thinking in terms of biologically inspired approaches to learning. And the idea there is simply like Donald Hebb's idea: if neuron A participates in firing neuron B, then we should strengthen the connection from A to B. That's the simplest version of Hebb's idea. And little tweaks on that may be helpful. But Jeff Hinton said, look, you really shouldn't, if you want to understand how the brain is doing this, you need to take a different approach. You need to ask yourself what you are trying to accomplish and find algorithms that move your connection weights in the direction of helping you accomplish that, right? So this is the whole idea of using gradient descent, or the notion of adjusting each connection in the brain so as to move it in the direction of reducing the discrepancy between the outputs that you produce and the ones that the environment suggests you ought to be producing. And so I should have a picture of Jeff at this point, because he convinced Drummelhart to try to figure this out. And then he went and did it. So they together published a paper in which they produced this algorithm that trained multi-layer neural networks to find connection weights that would solve the problems that were posed to them by the set of input-output patterns that they were trained on. And this became the basis of a lot of the subsequent work we did, but it's also the core of deep learning today. Backpropagation allows us to form, not only to learn what to do, but also to represent inputs in such a way as to make their representations helpful for producing the outputs that we need to produce. And so this is a very powerful extension, and one that allows us to have an alternative to the idea that we have to build in explicit rules. So from the point of view of understanding how we generalize, right? A neural network generalizes based on the idea that if there's a lot of overlap between the input and output experiences that it's already had and some new experience that comes in, then it'll be able to apply the knowledge and its connection weights to these new things. And that was exactly what happened in our model of the past tense. It's exactly what happens that allows deep learning models to process unfamiliar texts after they've been trained. Okay, so I'm going to have to move very quickly past this. We use this to model aspects of human semantic cognition, including the past tense, but also reading words aloud and understanding things about objects and their properties. But the core of this work for me was the observation that our early models could capture what was systematic about the relationships between, let's say, letters and pronunciations of words, while also at the same time being sensitive to exceptions and not really being exact implementations of rule systems. So they capture the quasi-regularity that the language actually has, So for example, consider this string MAVE. If you pronounce that in your head, well, when undergraduates at UCSD pronounce this in their head and then said it out loud, some of them said Mave and some of them said Mav. Now, both of those responses are partially consistent with rules like the letter M makes the sound and the letter V makes the sound V, and the letter E at the end is silent, okay? But Mav is like consistent with this exception word have, and Mave is consistent with all these other words that like save and Dave and cave and rave and wave that have that other correspondence, and our neural network models sort of capture the regularity, but also the exceptions in such a way as to reproduce the kinds of errors that people make, where they let the exceptions bleed in and influence their responses to novel items. So I think this is an intrinsic part of what makes contemporary language models good, is that they're actually sensitive to the nuanced structure of actual language, which is exhibited by things as simple as this. And the world of objects is like this too. Elephants have floppy ears, which is not predictable from the fact that they're four-legged animals. So there's idiosyncratic elements as well as shared ones. So it's quasi-regularity everywhere. All right. Okay, so somehow or other, I've sometimes been able to give this lecture in an hour, and maybe I just unpacked it a little bit more than usual. But I think probably it will only make sense if I continue talking for another, like, let's say 15 minutes, and then we have a short break, and then we have the last maybe 10, or I can say a few extra minutes over. Otherwise, I won't get to some really key points that I want to make. I'm going to skip over I'm going to skip over some things, but just say that, I think that these ideas of mutual multiple constraint satisfaction, learned distributed representations, that's what the model, so Ellman's little model simply learned to predict the next word from the current word using an intermediate layer that it could keep as a copy so it represented the previous context. And this little model learned representations, these hidden patterns of activation that actually separate that, the first thing they did was separate the world into nouns and verbs, just training it on simple sentences involving things like monsters chasing cats, or dogs chasing mice, or cats chasing mice, and things like that, or people eating food, or things. And just with simple sentences like that, the network learned to separate the representations of things into the nouns and verbs, and within that learn subcategories similar to the subcategories that linguists, animacy is a subcategory that's sometimes considered syntactic and sometimes semantic, because it actually has so many implications for how we understand language that some people have argued we should build it into the syntax, but it's really ultimately, of course, a semantic feature. And so is noun and verb. They're the things and the relations, right? So that can be discovered through learning. You don't have to build it in. Ellman even showed that sensitivity to long distance dependencies was possible in simple networks like that one. So I've argued for this sort of graded quasi-regularity principle, as well as for these other things. And I'm going to skip this slide for now. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, so we made some progress on this image originally in the 80s, but these models didn't seem to be scaling. People thought that very deep networks would, always scale very poorly. And they also thought that trying to predict things that were very distant in time would require you to propagate error signals backwards through many, many time steps, and this didn't seem to work. So there was a period of time when nobody was using neural networks, right? It was like we were excited about it in the 80s and 90s, but nobody else was by late 90s, and everybody was telling me I needed to be a Bayesian. I learned enough about it to know what the competition was, but I never changed my views. And so in the last few years, there have been these dramatic advances that have allowed us to overcome these limitations. We have models like AlphaGo, which completely dominate all humans in the ability to learn games like chess and Go. And we have these language models now that have completely swept away old-fashioned attempts to build structure into neural networks. So even those diehard computational linguists who were used to be building it in are now studying how they could see that the networks has essentially acquired some representation of this structure simply from its learning process. Okay. So why do we need depth in our neural networks? Well, the argument is that it's essential for allowing the network to actually capture the nuances that natural language reflects. You can't write down the rules explicitly. You need to capture them in connection weights, and they need to be sort of somehow distributed across multiple layers. So you can't find exactly where something is represented. It's actually very, very hard to analyze contemporary models because the representation of information is distributed across connection weights through multiple layers. You look at the representation at any given layer, it's sort of like, somehow it partially reflects structure, but you obviously can't assume that it's only there because there's many other layers where it could be represented. But it allows the system to gradually kind of adapt the way it treats particular elements in such a way as to capture nuances. So there is a challenge to this, which is exploiting the indefinite extent of the context that's relevant to language. So, most of the language models that people have are essentially predicting the next element of a sequence from past elements, just like Elman did in his simple recurrent network in the 1980s. But the thing is that the temporal separation between information that you might have been given about some aspect of something that you're hearing a story about or reading about in a book or something can be indefinite. You could put the book down and come back a week later, for example. So we need mechanisms that allow us to bridge these huge temporal gaps. So here's an example. John put some beer in a cooler and went out with his friends to play volleyball. Soon after he left, someone took the beer out of the cooler. Okay, and then there can be a long story about the volleyball game. First, John's team won the first game, the other team won the second game. But John's team sort of snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in the third game, and they were so excited. They came back to John's place to get some beers after the game. And when John opened the cooler, he discovered that the beer was gone, right? You know that that's what he's going to discover. You can anticipate that word, and our brains ought to predict it, and evidence suggests that they do. But where do we store that information? So this is a very important part of solving the problem for the brain. I think we need to be able to not only exploit the knowledge that's embedded in the connection weights that allow us to generally make predictions about what kinds of words might occur in this sentence. But they don't overly, so he might have discovered that the beer was warm if they'd taken the ice out of the cooler, for example. And you would have expected that if the previous sentences, somebody took the ice out of the cooler. And so we need the prior context to help constrain our understanding. So that's an important challenge. LSTMs, which were popular, around 10 years ago now, were partial solutions to this problem. But today we have query-based attention models. And so on this slide, I want to just say the tiniest bit about these models, because I think that they are hugely important in taking us towards really having the right degree of context sensitivity that Rumelhart was envisioning, okay? And that the last example illustrates. Can somebody just give me a sense, how many people in your audience may even know about like transformers or query-based attention? Are you all familiar with? No, okay. So have you heard of BERT or GPT-3? Yeah. Okay, they're transformer models, right? They use this mechanism. And I'm just going to try to explain it really briefly and connect it up with the ideas that I've been describing. So imagine you've read, John hit the ball with the, and now you get the word bat, okay? You want to interpret the meaning of this word in context. And it could be a small flying mammal, or it could be an instrument that you use to hit balls with, right? Obviously, the context is giving you a lot of information about that. The way this query-based attention mechanism essentially works is, as you are trying to figure out how to interpret the word bat, you actually issue a query, which is a pattern of activation, which you then compare to representations you have for all the words that occurred previously in the context. Okay, now I'm only representing 6 words here for the sake of simplicity, but in GPT-3, it can be as long as like roughly 4,000 previous words, right? And the thing is, you can compare this query to anything that's back there in all those 4,000 previous words in parallel. You actually imagine that each of them in the implemented transformer model, the calculation of this, how similar is this query to each of these patterns, is essentially happening in parallel, because the hardware is set up to allow a vector to be compared to many, many other vectors simultaneously, right? Vector matrix operations. So you get back a set of similarities of this query to these representations, and then you essentially turn these similarities into a set of values between 0 and 1, so that the strongest similarity gets the most of the weight. And then you add up these weighted representation vectors to get a weighted attention vector, which is, in this case, the query from BAT. You could think of it as, oh, is there a verb out there that somehow tells me something? If I knew what the verb was, I might know what kind of animal this was. If it was fly, I think it's a bat, a flying bat. If it's, so you find a verb, it returns this representation, and maybe there's a partial match to the preposition as well. So that's, and you add these things up and you get a weighted attention vector, which then may contain the information from anywhere in the past context to help you determine how to interpret the word bat. Okay, it is intrinsically invariant to where in the past context something occurred, because the representations are not dependent on position in the buffer, and it is and it queries everything that's in the buffer. Okay, up to 4,000 or so elements long. And so this sort of illustrates that. This particular model, it's not GPT-3, it's another one, has 24 layers of these transformer-like architectures that allow these queries to stretch back over 3,800 segments. This illustration only is showing like 12 or something, but it's kind of a schematic of how this this goes. So this is a very powerful idea about how we can use context. Okay, because I need to wrap up pretty soon, I'm going to skip this and come back to this mutual constraint satisfaction idea with the sentence from Rumelhart's paper, and then I have to get to the brain part later. We're going to just understand how the model called BERT is actually implementing Rumelhart's vision about mutual constraint satisfaction. So I want you to read these two sentences for me, okay? Jack and Jill went up the hill. The pole vault was the last event. Well, when we read these, actually, we see this word as went and this word is event, but actually they are the same bit of handwriting. It's actually Rumelhart's handwriting. And he basically cut and pasted his own handwriting out of one of these sentences and put it in the other one. And what he was arguing was that, as we've stressed throughout this talk, we use the context to help us figure out what the elements of our input are. And in this case, it's not even what the words are, but what the letters are, because we parse this as W here and E and V over here, right? So we're definitely doing this at the sentence level. And how do we do this? So this model called BERT is essentially doing something like this. And I'm just going to briefly describe this and then take a pause. So in their model, they're considering an example like my example with BAT, only they're using the word bank. So you're getting a phrase, the bank of the river. And their vision of this is that when you try to figure out how to represent each of the words in the sentence, you use both the preceding and the subsequent context to help constrain your search. So this query idea, there's a query issued from each word, like bank, issues a query. The keys from all the other words are compared to this query. That's what I'm illustrating here. You get the weightings out from this box here that says how much to weight the values returned from each of these locations in your weighted attention vector. And in this case, it might strongly weight river, which then causes that to, it leads you to infer that this is the side of a river, not a financial institution. And the amazing thing is, and this goes back to the question of what do you mean by parallel? In BERT, this is happening not just querying all the other positions in parallel, but all the positions are querying each other in parallel so that it's truly a mutual constraint satisfaction process. So this is Rumelhart's vision fully implemented in this learned distributed representation system. Yeah, okay. So I am going to skip some stuff. I'm just going to tell you that I think we need to extend this idea to capture what goes on in the brain. Language is a part of an integrated understanding system. But when we look at the world, we see objects and their relationships through our visual systems. And so we have an object representation system that's in one part of the brain, a language representation system in another part of the brain. These things are mutually connected to each other, so they can mutually constrain and inform each other. There's other parts of the brain that appear to represent the larger context, extending over about a minute or so of context, both and also capturing sort of more global spatial as well as temporal aspects. And in addition, there's another system in the hippocampus of the brain that allows us to bring information to bear from a lifetime of experience, because we store information in the hippocampus by making rapid adjustment to connection weights, and we use query-based attention to access anything that's stored in that system. And so my vision is that we have a BERT-like architecture in the cortex in these many different cortical regions all interacting with each other, and also interacting with these representations in the medial temporal lobe, which is the hippocampus is inside of that part of the brain as well. And this allows us to extend temporal context beyond any fixed limit, like in those transformer models that I was describing before. So I'm imagining there's a limited attentional window of truly parallel processing of the current situation and some degree of future stuff before we commit to our interpretation of the current word, using context, language, the objects that we see, any other aspects of our experience, and also querying our long-term memory. And that's how I think the integrated understanding system in the brain works. And yeah, so I'll stop there. So we're going to take a 2 or 3 minute break and then.
Yeah, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will be back for the Q&A session where we can discuss deeply.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for sticking around and listening. So I'll just.
Individuals, thank you. Perfect. We have a question from Dr. Esra Mungan. Please go ahead.
Sure, hi.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful talk. And when you said that this compositional nature of language is actually, I mean, that situations are compositional, I thought you would go in the direction of, that, so the world is compositional, there's structure in the world, but your model is very bottom up, right? And I do see the point regarding the rules, so I'm also very much there. But I wonder whether there's some kind of direct perceptional thing in the, let's say in the Gibson sense, or where there's like the structure out there. And I don't know whether you, there was a wonderful talk also by Melanie Mitchell, who talked about, you know, certain insufficiencies of these deep learning models, that there's like this lack of knowledge. And I see that you compensate for this lack of knowledge with the MTL, with this hippocampus, the memory system. And I'm doing music cognition work, and I'm a cognitive psychologist. And in mainstream cognitive psychology, there's always this thing about schemata. Also Bransford and so on use this example where there's a paragraph which you barely understand unless you get the title, right. Where you activate, But now this aside, I also think that this also still does not explain this one beautiful example you gave with this, you know, the beer in the refrigerator, and then there's like all the soccer match in between. Mm-hmm. And how do you come back? And this I would love to call the 1001 Nights thing, where a story starts, and then you have a story in a story, a story in a story in a story. It's like these parentheses, right? And interestingly, and children also quite quickly can like get back to the outer frame. Yeah. And music is also a little bit like that. So with the first chord, it almost already tells you the ending. And it's like a pregnant to all the things that happen in between. And music, unlike language, is nobody knows the rules. So non-musicians also perfectly understand that. And again, infants very quickly pick up on that. So it's not really like the rules of Chomsky, but like something, this structure in nature, the simultaneous structure in nature.
Let me just try to respond. I think there's certainly both in the structure of visual inputs and the structure of musical chords and their progressions, there is indeed structure, and we become sensitive to it. I think in music, of course, the cultural element is clear, right? It's, yes, there are things about an octave which make the octave actually, you know, the octave note actually fit exactly into the one below it, and other harmonics fit into that, and so on. And that's what we're doing in chords. We're bringing out different ones of those harmonics, and injecting dissonances and so on. But the ones that we appreciate and the ones that will allow us to anticipate other subsequent elements are things that depend on our learning, as well as some initial tendencies for particular harmonic patterns to be naturally perceptible. So I think that that's true of sound. I think it's true of the visual world is sort of organized in depth in our visual systems. This is largely neglected in deep learning systems. They don't actually represent the disparity of input in depth the way the neurons in our brain do. And we know that our neurons, of course, are doing that. So, you know, I always wonder why people don't build that into their deep neural networks. Maybe it's because they're actually interested in just doing as best as they can with pictures that don't have that anyway. So I don't know, but in general, I think that there are features of the inputs that our brains, you know, did more or less evolve to be sensitive to, and that as advanced human sort of members of cultures where these things have been adopted for the sake of creating beautiful music or systems of formal reasoning, they've been exploited for the sake of allowing us to, you know, be able to think deep mathematical thoughts as well as to appreciate music. And that's a whole nother line of argument that I'm currently very much how we're able to appreciate the structure of mathematical relationships after we become immersed in those kinds of systems. music is an interesting one because it's similar in some ways, but different in others. And I think the intuitive and the rule govern. I mean, there are rules about, chord progressions and so on that we learn, and they're useful, right? But they're not everything about music. There's much more. So I don't think that you need anything intrinsically different from deep neural networks that use massively parallel computation to settle on interpretations of things, except at the level of what happens when we become PhD students and professors, or when we aspire to be contributors to the development of knowledge. And there's a huge amount of explicit cognition that then overlays all of this, and I believe is similar to our what we learn through just immersion and how our language encodes information. There's special languages of music and of mathematics that we learn, and we learn to have the same kinds of implicit expectations and intuitions about them that we have about ordinary objects and their relations. So that's what I would say to Melanie. To a degree, I do feel that there's two elements missing. One maybe some aspect of the affordances at the basic level of experience, but the other is the explicit representation, as in the mind of somebody like Chomsky himself, saying, oh, look, these sentences all consist of subject noun phrases followed by verb phrases, and even when they don't look like that, we could imagine transforming them in such a way that underlyingly we would see that they all have that characteristic, right? And he gets up on his high horse and he decides that he must be God because he saw this and that he can tell everybody how to think. But that's sort of beside the point, right? It's more like, gee, there's some really interesting ability that we have to kind of like abstract and think in terms of, but I think he only acquired that ability because of his immersion in an advanced sort of educational setting that gave him those abilities. And I think that all of the cultures that we grow up in, even sort of indigenous cultures deep in the Amazon, where they don't care about exact quantity, there's still a culture there, and there's still things that they care about that they cause each other to encode and learn and think about themselves. And so, yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I'm answering your question. There's definitely parts of it that remain to be answered, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Dr. Emra Hagtun.
Hello.
Hi. I'm not sure if you're hearing me. Yeah. Thank you for organizing this wonderful talk, and thank you, Professor McClelland. I am going to ask a question more about the brain aspect or the implementation aspect of things, because you did mention, about how to figure out how the brain does this and all that. And I was just wondering, in general, what is your view of the recent developments in neural network modeling? It's not a lot. There's, as far as I know, at least, there is a few groups of neural network modelers who are incorporating a glial function into their models. The one thing that, the one group that comes to mind, I think, is a group at Purdue. They're, I think, building models with astrocytes built into the neural network. And I was just, as one of the founders of neural network modeling, I was wondering what your opinion is of those approaches.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I recently heard a talk about a role that astrocytes might play in the brains of little tiny zebrafish. And the argument there was that the astrocytes kind of represented a buffering system that would build up sort of a representation of how long the little fish had been struggling against the current. And once that built up to a certain level, the fish would sort of like say, I should relax and let the current carry me back a little bit before I try to start swimming upstream again against the current. And they did some beautiful work showing that, you know, if they intervened in the astrocytes in some way that I can't remember, they could actually change the extent to which the animals would do this. So exactly how the astrocytes interface with the neurons to allow that to occur is something that I don't remember in detail, but I think that it's perfectly reasonable to think that they play roles like that. And I think that there's always room for more, for remaining open to actual aspects of the physical brain that could be contributing in ways that I'm ignoring when I just say neurons and synapses and things like that. So I'm totally on board with the possibility that there's more to that story, and that we'll learn more as people pursue that kind of work.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we have another question from, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Tabello?
By name, it's Tabello.
Tabello, right?
Yes. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate. So I wanted to ask about pattern completion and pattern separation, because when you presented that slide with time and the separation of the individual letters, right, to create the words, I wondered, well, the feature integration of perception of the letters and words seems to involve pattern separation from words to letters and pattern completion from letters to words. At least that's how I looked at it. And even when you present your next slide, I think you showed hidden layers, and I started thinking, hang on, that's a dentate gyrus. So I wondered, well, am I confusing ideas or what's happening here? Every single talk I attend about deep neural networks, they seem to abstract ideas that relate to pattern separation and pattern completion, but nobody ever says those terms, makes those references. Is it because they are irrelevant, or what's going on? Clarity, please.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. And let me tell you how I tend to use these terms myself. So if I experience an input which is ambiguous, like that, well, maybe let's see, even inconsistent. Okay, so I say, I hear gift or I hear kift. Okay, so kift is not a word. So there's two possibilities. One is that I would actually hear it as gift, and that would be more like pattern completion. I would say, well, wait a minute, this isn't exactly what the input was. It's this other thing that I already know. And that means that I'm going to replace the k with a g sound and eventually hear it as gift. Alternatively, I might settle into the state where I actually perceive it as this novel, distinct sound. Then I'm separating this item from that other item. Okay, so that's what, so how do we, and clearly both of these kinds of things occur. Sometimes we assimilate something that is a little strange towards a familiar representation, and that would be pattern completion. Other times we say, no, I need to sort of begin to realize that there may be a word gift. And I should form a representation of that and store that, so in the interactive activation model, we'd have to create a separate neuron for it. In the way the hippocampus works, we imagine that somehow or other the circuit recruits new neurons so that, or another random subset of the existing neurons is the way I actually think about it, so that the word, this new word gift gets a pattern, gets a unique pattern inside the hippocampus that's separate from the one for the word gift that already exists. And that's pattern separation to me. And that's what I think it usually means to people who do research in the hippocampus, where they place animals in environments, they morph the environment a little bit. Under some circumstances, the animal may have a completely different hippocampal place map of the environment. And in other circumstances, it will be very similar to the one from the similar environment before. So one of those is considered pattern completion. I've simulated this to the old environment, and I think I'm there again with some slight changes. Or this is separation, and I think, oh, I should represent this as a whole different environment now. And you see this in patterns of activation in neurons in the hippocampus. So that's what I mean by separation and completion. When we compare like the feature letter and the word level, the letter level and the word level in the interactive activation model, I think that the whole system could go into the completion mode and sort of override the bottom-up input and make it be gift, or it could, I don't know if we fully encompassed that in our original, we didn't fully encompass that in our original model, but in the case where you actually are looking at a non-word and you see it as such, I imagine that, that these separation-like processes are occurring, and what just wasn't implemented in that original one.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That was an interesting question, and I'm glad to hear. So this business about linking, these computational models with these really hairy, huge computations that are described in terms of embeddings and matrices and queries and keys and values, to patterns of activation in the brain, which are described in terms of actual neurons and synapses, biologically plausible learning rules. It's such an exciting world to be able to live in, because many people who do one level of analysis never think about the other, and vice versa. But I've been blessed by the opportunity to try to keep thinking about both. All right, I see we have another question from someone called Furkat. Hi.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk, and thanks for the organization. I was gonna ask a question about the last slide, which was the neuroscientific implication of these models. So you said, you mentioned that there can be a bird-like model that can realize the neuroscientific model of the brain. And do you know of any model that implements the language, vision, object interactions? Do you know any model that did that, studied this until now?
There's a lot of things going on where people are doing things that are similar and related, but not exactly the same, as far as I know. The big challenge is that, actually incorporating the visual world together with the world of language in a artificial system is extremely complicated. And people do simple things like they have pictures, and they imagine that there's a visual system that is organized to parse the picture into objects and then link the parsed image into with language by describing, the relationships between the objects in the picture using language. Like there's a plate and there's a fork to the left and a knife to the right, and on the plate there's some chicken and some rice, or something like that. And this is very much sort of relating visual input to language. It's kind of a one-way street in most of the models that I'm familiar with, where you're going from the image to the description of it, and you're so what I would love to see is cases where the language sort of changes the way you see the objects in the scene, and the representations of the objects are influenced by the language, like it reparses like you say, oh, look, there's a vase there, and you see a vase, or look, there's two faces looking at each other there, and you see the two faces in that ambiguous sort of face vase kind of image, for example. I don't know of too many models that do that, but I think that I'd like to see more of that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have another question from Dr. Esra Mengen.
Maybe because Emre didn't, I already asked a question. Maybe we could have Emre Uğur first, and then I can go. This is a very quick, short question. Thank you. Emre, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Esra. So thanks very much for the great talk. So my question is not directly related to your talk, but this is a question that I'm always curious about. So I'm a computer scientist, and so I'm always curious about the relation between language and reasoning and planning capabilities in the brain. So in computer science, in general, traditionally, we use discrete structures and rules. We have been using those for language previously, and at the moment for planning sequence of actions for particular goals, we have these AI planning techniques, and we don't have these neural networks yet. On the other hand, we don't know much about planning and reasoning in the brain, right? So what do you think? How are they related? Do we need language, or do we use language-related items, capacities when we do planning? It is not just rational decision-making, but planning sequence of steps, actions. So this is a general question, but I'm very curious about this. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, but I guess my inclination is to think that a lot of the relatively automatic kind of planning we do as we're navigating around in the world, and we see sort of like obstacles in front of us that we need to navigate around in order to kind of continue up a hill or something like that. We don't need to kind of like really become super conscious of them. There's various relatively basic perceptual motor sort of anticipatory systems in our brains that essentially are doing a lot of that work. Probably somewhat experience dependent, but given that, baby gazelles start running and getting their way up the hill somehow, even right after birth, I feel like this is a place where there's probably a lot of built-in structure that at least gives us the ability to run away from something, if not to sort of plan future behaviors. We also know that you can train animals to use things like oh, if I turned left last time I came up this channel, I should turn right the next time. And so they can make figure eights through an environment. And we know that they learn to maintain a context as they're going up through that channel, which is somewhat like, what might happen in a recurrent neural network that sort of represents the previous state, so that they can then use that to guide the choice they're going to make when they get to the end point. And you can actually see them little pre-playing what their world is going to look like after they make the turn to the left or the right, depending on which way they're actually going to go when they get there, during the time when they're proceeding up this central aisle of this figure eight like environment that they're in. So I don't think language is crucial for that, because I don't think that these rodents have any language, but they have the ability to use prior context to plan their future actions, and they seem to be doing that in those settings, at least in rudimentary ways. I'm surprised that you don't think there's that much going on of this kind, though, because I know I'm not a roboticist myself, but I think there are a lot of people in robotics who are currently sort of trying to understand how neural networks can essentially take an input situation and devise an implicit plan that then allow them to act appropriately given a particular situation. I think that when we plan, we can be goal-directed in our planning in ways that are very explicit. And I think that this is one of the very important ways in which social communication, language, very importantly, plays a role in this. So we can say to someone, can you please put all those boxes in that corner of the room and make sure that you don't lay them on their side because the things inside them are fragile. But make sure you keep them in their upright orientation when you put them over there, and people can, take that instruction and act on it, right? So we can take arbitrarily specified goals given to us in language and execute them in service of various tasks. And this is a very important basic aspect that we expect everyone to be able to do once they've, reached a certain age and have gone through rudimentary education. And I think when we're planning things like, oh, could you please write me a computer program that would do X, Y, or Z, and et cetera, we're doing some very similar things. We're giving explicit instructions that specify aspects of the situations we wish to achieve, and we're expecting that our agents are going to, each other and our artificial agents are going to be able to take these arbitrary specifications and act on them to produce situations in the world that conform with what we requested. So this is is something I'm actually thinking about right now. I think it's a very important central aspect of human intelligence, that we are able to take arbitrarily specified goals given in linguistic descriptions and use them to control our behavior, and also to explain to others what we would like them to do, so that they will be able to carry out things that we request them to do in cooperative settings and so on. So that's what I have to say in response to your question. I always myself feel that ultimately it will be better to imagine that the abstract characterizations which we can give in language, like all those boxes over there and make sure that you don't tip any of them over. It doesn't specify which ones are on the top and which ones are on the bottom, or all sorts of other details of it. It just gives some aspects of the constraints that you want to see solved. and you let the solver sort of work that stuff out, that's a very important thing that we need to be working towards if we're going to capture real human intelligence in artificial systems, or understand the brain's actual intelligence in the real biology of it. I hope that relates a little bit to your question.
Thank you very much.
All right, please go ahead, Dr. Munga.
I have a question about, and it relates to what we have been talking right now, also to Emre's question. And you were also mentioning these, we have the Aykut and Erhan brothers here, who are also right here, because they told me about something where these artificial networks can identify objects, and as you said, then give a verbal description of what they see. So they do this parsing, this grouping, figure ground segregation, these gestaltes things, and then they can actually depict with using a verbal language what they that picture is representing, and they seem to be doing a quite good job there. And in a talk where we kind of discuss whether, you know, in psychology we have our participants and they just produce some output, and we rarely ask them how they solve a problem, what their thinking processes were, why they remember something or not, and why they perceive something like that. So we don't really ask them much about their phenomenal experiences, and I kind of think that we have to start doing it. And there, Aykut or Erhan, Adam were saying that, you know, actually in artificial networks, we even started to have our networks describe how they came to that, came up with this result, with the solution, with that output. And I was like, oh, wonderful. So you do it, we psychologists still don't do it. And I was wondering whether this metacognitive, you know, whether you also have that in your model. So could your model also then, you know, talk about what it's doing? Thanks.
Well, I think that, you know, that's a totally fantastic question, and it is what I'm thinking about a lot myself. So as I was just describing, you know, the ability to take a linguistic specification of a task and then carry that out, but also to be able to give a specification to somebody else and then they could carry it out. But over and above that, you can also explain, you know, well, this is the way to carry the box so that you don't tip it over, or this is why this step is important here. You know, when you're cooking, there's all these little details of how you should prepare things in advance, or what you should do to make it so that they'll turn out to produce just the right sort of level of rise in the cake or whatever. And why do we have to preheat the oven? Well, you know, various kinds of, you can give explanations for all of that stuff. And you can also explicitly break down a complex task into subtasks for people. And they can follow these instructions, and then suddenly they can solve problems that they have no idea how to solve if you just give them a key, sort of like, break it down this way. And, oh, okay, well, then I can get started, right? And so, and I think that as advanced human problem solvers, we ask ourselves to come up with such explicit ideas, and we formulate sub-goals in explicit terms. But, you know, like I was arguing throughout the talk, I don't want to like build a neuro-symbolic architecture that has symbolic representations of those rules explicitly in it. I want those to be things that we learn how to produce using language as the medium through which we actually then make them abstract and explicit, right? So, yeah, that's another talk that I'm going to be giving in 2 weeks somewhere else.
Thanks.
Okay, it's been 2 hours, and it's been a pleasure for me, but I really have to go now and get on with other things in my day. So thanks a lot for your very interesting, broad questions, and I've enjoyed having a chance to share my ideas with you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.